Welcome again to this webinar, How Can We Use a Health Crisis to Create Healthier, More Resilient Communities? My name is Kate Murphy and my colleague Elena Chia is also on the line today. We're both from Fraser Basin Council and we're very lucky to have speakers Jade Yehia and Dr. Shannon Waters here to share their knowledge on the line as well. So usually I work out of the Vancouver office for Fraser Basin Council, but over the past number of months, I've been working from home in Ladner. And Ladner is featured in this picture. This is one of my favorite micro areas of Ladner. It's a part of the Fraser River with the Tluckvin Slough connecting with it. And Ladner's on the territory of Tsawwassen Nation, Musqueam Nation, Kwantlen Nation, Stamanis Nation, Katzie Nation, and Stalo Nation. And as an uninvited Irish and Dutch guest on these territories, I know that it's my responsibility to examine the white settler privilege that I have in this country and also to work towards decolonizing not only the structures that exist in this country, but also the structures that exist within myself. So welcome to everyone from the territories that you are hailing from this morning. This webinar is brought to you by the BC Regional Adaptation Collaborative, which supports local governments, Indigenous nations, and industries in planning for climate change adaptation. And we have a resource database on adaptation resources at retooling.ca. This is an image of it as it is currently, but exciting news, next month it will be renovated. So if you're on our retooling newsletter, you will get a notice about the launch of the brand new and very shiny website. If you're not on our newsletter, you can sign up now on our website as well, retooling.ca, and we send out roughly monthly newsletters on adaptation resources, opportunities, funding, events, and other things of interest, mostly in the BC context. We also put all of our webinars online, so this one will be recorded and put online, and we have all of our other repository of webinars uploaded as well, and I'll send out all the details about this one being online to everybody who's registered. So a few logistics before we start. Please keep your audio muted. If you have any questions, put them in the question box at any time. We'll have probably 2 Q&A sessions depending on how timing goes. So just throw them in the question box and we'll get to them during those sessions. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can put those in the question box or email fraserbasin@gmail.com and Elena will help you out with that. So the most exciting part of my introduction, the introduction to the speakers that we are so lucky to have with us here this morning, Jade Yehia and Dr. Shannon Waters. And thank you both for being here. I'm just going to give a quick bio and then we'll get on to Jade's presentation. So Jade is an environmental health officer who has been Island Health's Healthy Built Environment Specialist for the past 7 years. Her work focuses on bringing a broad public health perspective to land use planning regarding housing and homelessness, air quality, climate change, neighborhood design, and environmental protection across Island Health portfolios and externally with local governments and community partners. Specific to encampments, she has developed policy and performed and supported site visits, ensuring health and safety standards are met. She is passionate about creating healthier communities for all. Thanks for being here, Jade. And Dr. Shannon Waters is Coast Salish and a member of Stamanis First Nation on Vancouver Island. She completed the First Nations Family Practice Program at the University of British Columbia and worked as a family doctor in Duncan, BC. While honored to work close to home, Shannon became frustrated with seeing people mostly when they were unwell and wanted to focus on keeping people healthy in the first place. So she returned to school and completed her specialty training in public health and preventive medicine. Shannon worked as the Director of Health Surveillance at First Nations and Inuit Health Branch and at First Nations Health Authority as the Acting Senior Medical Officer for Vancouver Island Region. She is currently honored to have come full circle and to be working in her home territory as the local medical health officer with Island Health. Thank you as well, Dr. Waters, for being here with us today. So Jade, I'll pull up your poll first. Jade has a question. She wants to get a sense of the sectors of people on the line. So I'll give you about 30 seconds to fill that out, and then I'll close it. So maybe about 10 more seconds for folks. All right, so, okay, it looks like we have folks from a lot of sectors on the line, mostly local government. We have a good amount of provincial and federal government, non-governmental organizations or academia, and some folks from Indigenous nations and private sector. So very happy to have you all on the line, and I'll pass it over to you now, Jade, for your presentation.
All right. Hi, everyone. I hope I'm coming through loud and clear.
Great.
Thanks, Kate. Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's a pleasure and honor to be here today talking to you all about how we can use the health crisis to create healthier, more resilient communities. So I thought I'd just start off by kind of asking you all a bit of a question about what do we need in our communities, in your communities. It's funny, I used to put this slide up and say we need places to live, work, and play. However, I really think for the most part, many of us have figured out that we can now work from home. So I think that more of us are thinking about the live and the play part of that. And so hence I changed it, that we need places to live, play, and connect safely. Of course, we continue to need water, clean water, fresh air, and wholesome food to eat. That's the live part. But we're social beings, and we also need to be able to play and connect safely with each other. I'm sure for many of you, you may have seen this, this graphic, and I'm sorry, it's not from the Canadian Medical Association, for the Washington Post. And it was about physical distancing and how it was looking at how coronavirus or COVID-19 transmits throughout the population. And this is under a simulation of physical distancing. But it's funny, when I looked at this picture, I really thought about, you know, how we are all kind of slowing down and have had to self-isolate and stay closer to home. We've had to slow down, restrict our travel, and really our movements. So when thinking about that, with all of us spending more time, you know, at home, I want you to maybe just take a moment and think about your neighborhood. You know, what's your house like? What do you see on a regular basis? Is there green or blue space in close proximity to you? How do you get to work, or can you now work from home? Or get groceries? Where is that for you? What's, say, 20 minutes from you by foot? So a lot of core of the work that I do is making those connections between health and the built environment. And maybe I'll just pose this question to you, is why link it? Why link health and the built environment? Well, we know that as Canadians, we spend about 90% of our time inside, 80% of our time in urbanized environment. And so the design, construction, operation, and maintenance of the built environment has a major influence on health and well-being. It's important to improve the health of the population through healthy built environments by promoting active transportation such as walking and cycling, pedestrian safety, access to green space, accessible community services and recreation, child-friendly and age-friendly environments. And these elements of our built environment can really protect physical health, improve mental health, and encourage our social well-being. We know research shows us that health has much more to do with our postal code than our genetic code. So, and do you have the healthy choice being the easy choice in your neighborhood? I popped up there about the 80, 100 rule, and I'm channeling a lovely professor and public health champion. You know, I mentioned that we live in an 80% urbanized environment, that we spend 90% of our time inside. But Dr. Trevor Hancock would add to that we spend 100% of our time on planet Earth or in nature, in the natural world. So how environments, you know, affect our health. You know, many of you may be familiar with the social determinants of health. It's a little bit more detail here about how the environments in which we live affects our health and well-being. Those environments, which include our social and economic environments, like our income levels, they set the context for how we live and what resources, like a good job or good education or good quality housing, we have access to. Those environments also influence our social networks and the way in which our communities function, which in turn really affect our lifestyles, like the kinds of food we eat and how active we are. All of these factors work together to influence both our health as individuals and our community's health and well-being. You know, one piece that's, I think, really you know, was jumping out and I was reflecting a great deal on in preparation for today's webinar is about the aspect of social connectedness. When we think about resilience, I find them just one, you know, kind of synonymous. And a socially connected community is a place where really everyone feels like they belong. This is a pre-COVID stat that 32% of British Columbians do not feel a sense of belonging to their local community. And we know that Canadians with a strong sense of belonging are over twice as likely to report that their health is good. The health effects associated with social connectedness are lower rates of heart disease, cancer, and better health among the elderly. And in fact, social isolation, or maybe more aptly coined as loneliness, particularly among seniors, is a factor in the development of chronic illness and is as strong a factor in early death as smoking 15 cigarettes per day. So I flash up an excerpt from a very seminal document that any healthy built environment professional working out there is really quite familiar with, and I'm sure many planners and health professionals like, the Healthy Built Environment Linkages Toolkit. And there's an excerpt in there around social well-being and how planning and the built environment can help to increase social well-being. There's, you know, 5 key principles in that the evidence shows to be so strong and true, that street connectivity and active transportation help to increase our social well-being. So does our quantity and quality of green spaces. I think something we've appreciated so much during the pandemic thus far. What about our perceptions of safety in the built environment? Do you feel safe to even walk through certain spaces and places? Aspects of inclusivity, so placemaking and being engaged in your community. What about aspects of public art, heritage conservation, and I'd maybe add in there design. I think that's going to be a really important piece during and post-pandemic. So we know that a sense of community belonging also decreases with our increasing commute time. Excerpt from My Health, My Community in the Lower Mainland, that we know that the longer you are sitting in a car commuting, the less inclined you are to feel socially connected to your community. And people who feel socially connected report better mental well-being. In fact, from this particular study, people with a very strong sense of community belonging are 3.2 times more likely and those with a larger network of people to confide in are 3.4 times more likely to report very good mental health. So, you know, thinking about the pandemic and there's really an opportunity, and we're seeing it. There's an opportunity to close down our streets, widen our sidewalks, create new bike lanes, and redistribute land use, allowing for more physical distancing and safety for active commuting. And there's a co-benefit here. These changes include allowing more physical activity and opportunities for safe, low carbon traveling. They're really taking our streets back and putting people first. This is some research that came from UBC, from Dr. Larry Frank and his team, looking at the chronic disease findings, understanding how where you live really matters so integrally to your health. So just a couple of facts that I'll pull out from the slide related to active transportation. If we think about walkability, people living in a somewhat walkable area are 20% more likely to walk for transportation, and people in a walkable area are 45% more likely compared to those living in a car-dependent area. People in a walkable area are 17 times more likely to meet that weekly recommended level of physical activity compared to those living in a car-dependent area. And that's connected to, physical activity is of course directly affected to aspects of levels of obesity. And people living in a walkable area are 42% less likely to be obese compared to those living in a car-dependent area. I'll flip down further along the slide and maybe just linger once more on the sense of community stat. That people living in a moderately walkable area are 24% more likely to have a strong sense of community belonging, and people in a walkable area are 47% more likely compared to those living in a car-dependent area. I think those are some pretty staggering stats. Talking about parks and open spaces. I think there's lots that I could say about the natural environment, but I just thought I'd linger here for a second. Obviously these images represent and demonstrate man-made natural spaces like our parks. Really, the importance of available, accessible green space has really been truly highlighted by the pandemic. And even before physical distancing and more isolation-related measures, green space accessibility, size, and quality, and tree density was found to be positive for mental health. So these are aspects that we've always known to be so true, and now they're, I think, being amplified and magnified during the COVID pandemic, as are many of our challenges and problems and opportunities. Access to green space should be considered as part of that complete community, and there may be a need to rethink conventional green space to accommodate for more physically distanced interactions and quiet reflectivity in a neighborhood, as well as considering roofs and other refuges, developing a strategy for equitable access equitable access to green space, and leading to healthier and more resilient communities. I had the pleasure of attending a workshop just last week from the Healthy Built Environment Alliance, and it was some emerging research that had just kind of hot off the press, looking at green space, fostering that connection. And I'll just kind of pull a couple of excerpts because it really resonated with me, is that view from within. There's been a lot of research for many, many years on this subject, that in a healthcare setting, viewing landscapes dominated by plants, flowers, and trees and other greenery can produce a significant restorative effect within just even a few minutes. Studies have shown that 40 seconds of green roof views, for example, can improve our cognitive performance and boost attention span. But maybe I'll go one step further, and I could say a lot about this study. I definitely encourage you to check it out. But thinking about building entrances, they're high traffic areas, especially in our more urban environments and multifamily buildings. But you could see them as almost social spaces. They're drawing occupants to the outdoors and welcoming occupants inside. If you create that greenery there, it can encourage that kind of social interaction. The presence of vegetation at building or site entrances actually ensures that all users are exposed to associated green benefits as they enter and exit. And you could go one step further, as this study did, but not only just in those viewscapes, but also aspects of creating through the built environment, and especially probably more in the urban environment, is creating those spaces of refuge. So aspects where the presence of cool spots where neighborhood dwellers can find protective temperatures during extreme heat events. Thinking about local food systems, I think this has probably been really top of mind for many of us as well. I'm reflecting about my own situation. I live on an island, and we have an estimated 7 days of food supply to sustain us if there was really a serious disaster that cut us off from Vancouver. We're seeing that shift, or say, I guess I could say, an appreciation from where our food comes from, lining up and grocery stores fighting or hoarding over supplies. And one of the industries that has been booming during COVID is gardening. More people with having time to grow. We know, and this is also pre-pandemic, that participation in community-based food programs such as community kitchens or community and school gardens, they provide those meaningful opportunities for people to connect and build a sense of community, and also increase our consumption of fruits and vegetables. School gardens encourage healthier food preferences among young people and are associated with an increase in food literacy. So the more we can invest in local food sourcing, we can reduce our carbon footprint, and we can increase our resiliency and our health. I think another opportunity that COVID has really showcased for us is, seeing a lot of rapid action needed to respond to the crisis. And there's that, opportunity that exists to on the health linkages to getting people housed, especially those with housing insecurity. We've seen securing temporary hotels and motels and creating encampments. I mean, they don't alleviate the much deeper issue of homelessness, but health evidence shows really that need to prioritize access to permanent and safe housing for those who are homeless, as this decreases their use of emergency services and helps them stay safe from violence, injury, and communicable disease. So we can all have that shelter in place option and opportunity and reduce the risks for us collectively. Sorry, that last image on the bottom there is actually from a tiny house village in the US called Quitzote Village, where they've, I hope I've said that right, where they've actually created kind of a tiny house village for those who were previously homeless or housing insecure. Shannon, I hope you don't mind I flashed this one up there for you, because I remember you talking to me or presenting on this particular slide once upon a time. I was actually a little surprised that it's all men in this graphic, so my apologies for that, but I thought it kind of a, we are all in this boat together, and a rising tide really truly does raise all ships. And if you're sure glad the cold isn't at our end, well, it's coming for you. I thought I'd just share something with you, and it's kind of a bit of a plug, a shameless plug, if I may. There's some work being done, and this was again pre-pandemic, and it's being updated to reflect the impacts of the pandemic. But BC CDC has been working, or so BC Center for Disease Control has been working on a social environments framework, and looking at how, it's not just the built environment, but so much of the other ties that bind us together, the combination of social, economic, and environmental, cultural, and political conditions identified by individuals and their communities as essential for them to flourish and fulfill their potential. So stay tuned for this. This should be released later this fall, but a social environments framework, which is kind of taking that healthy built environment framework and adding the social environment at its foundation. So I encourage, I guess, maybe you all to reflect on this aspect of multi-solving. Actually, this is in that social environments framework, where we are finding solutions rooted in equity that reduce our fossil fuel use and produce those co-benefits in health, well-being, and resilience. And really, what is community resilience? It's the capacity of communities to respond, recover, and accommodate external shocks and stressors. And aren't we still feeling that so much today? Anyways, I thank you for this opportunity. Here's my contact information if you have any further questions, but I'm definitely open to any questions if time permits. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jade. I am so inspired by the options you presented for decreasing loneliness and increasing housing, and ensuring people feel like they're a part of a community. And we do have some questions, so I think we'll go through some of them, and then after a couple questions, we can pass it over to Dr. Waters for her presentation, and we'll have a fuller Q&A with both of you at the end. And if anybody has any other questions, feel free to put those in now too. But Jade, you really referenced some fantastic initiatives to make stronger communities. Do you have any examples of work that's been done in community that you would really reference when showcasing best practices?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you for that, Kate. You know, I think that many communities are grappling with this, and as we are restarting, going back to school and recovering, well as being, conscious of the pandemic, and it's still obviously taking those precautions. These principles, I think, are being so, embedded in. To planning processes. One, as soon as you asked the question, one example came to mind. I did some work, had the pleasure of doing some work with a township of Esquimalt, and this was pre-pandemic, and they were looking at how they could embed, social well-being into multifamily homes. And I think sometimes when we think about the built environment, some of the, like when we're talking about climate change, it can seem rather overwhelming and immense. And I think sometimes those small little actions can make such a huge impactful difference and actually don't cost us much money. Like the study said there, just even plantings at entrance and exit ways of buildings can have that opportunity for people to organically connect with each other. Even just welcoming lobby spaces has that impact. And I definitely encourage anyone to check out the township's work, because they dug deeper into this and other interventions that could be considered not only in the public realm, but in the semi-private or private realm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for that answer. So another question, how are we to apply social framework in rural and tiny communities that have no funding for community spaces or projects? Any suggestions around that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a great one. I do see a lot of the frameworks that often come out. They do have a lot of the research is really rooted in that kind of urban environment. And so how can this be translated to a rural context? And I would say maybe some of it doesn't even translate well. I think rural remote communities actually have sometimes a real advantage, because people know each other more. I've had the pleasure of living more rural and remotely, and I remember just, having a bit more of a sense of connection to my community, a sense of connection to my neighbors, um, as well as, the beautiful natural environment within your doorstep. But I also do think that sometimes it is those small interventions. You know, I think of a couple of communities that I worked with on the west coast of Vancouver Island, where they were working to just support active transportation infrastructure that worked for them. So taking like District of Tofino, I always tell them, because I think it's such an amazing trail that they've created, that multimodal path that's completely off the highway. And they have huge ridership, probably one of the most active riderships for us, for cyclists and people who are walking and using their feet rather than burning fat rather than fuel to get to point A to point B. Maybe it's something as simple as that. And I realize that's not so simple. Creating, public spaces, even like a community square, something of that nature that can really help to create those kind of pro-social spaces. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, if the individual who asked it would like to expand any more, but I think that's a great answer for now. And another question that came in, is there any work having shade trees in parking lots for drivers or visitors at hospitals and travelers with pets getting groceries, etc. at stores?
Another excellent question. I can, I guess, only speak to my own experience here, but I know I've been, working quite closely with our island health folks, our director of sustainability and whatnot, and we definitely, that has come bubble to the surface without a doubt. I mean, there's always kind of that thirst, that need, request for more parking. So, is there ways that we can ensure that there is green space peppered through those, what we all know to be, really can negatively impact that urban heat island effect on a local level. So I think it's coming, but it can sometimes be a little bit slow to come. But yes, I think there's definitely work from the development community in that regard as well. But we shall soon see. I think you know, we're going to see the necessity for that more and more as temperatures do rise. So
Amazing. Jade, thank you so much. We will come back to another Q&A session, which you will be a part of, but I will pass it over to Shannon now, and we'll have the joint Q&A session after her presentation.
thank you.
So Shannon, I've just passed it over. Hopefully that's showing up all right on your screen.
Can you see my slides?
Yes, looks great.
Great, thanks. So, Ait Naitath, good morning, everyone. And yeah, a real pleasure to be presenting to you here this morning on such an important topic with my friend and colleague, Jade, who I have the pleasure of following here. And so I'm going to expand on the information that Jade has shared with us so far around how we can use this health crisis to create healthier, more resilient communities, and really looking, expanding in terms of, things that we've been talking about, housing, into what it means when we talk about home. Just want to acknowledge a few things before I start. I am presenting to you today here on the traditional territory of the Hokkamitan people. I am someone who's giving a perspective as an Indigenous person on the shoulders of many peoples, including not just the human peoples, but the plants, animals, waters, land, who have been part of Indigenous health systems since time immemorial. And I also want to acknowledge the excitement, enthusiasm, and potential that we have together with the over 100 people who are part of this webinar here today. In giving you a little bit more context to myself, I am mixed blood, Coast Salish, Hokkamitan on my mother's side, and Swedish, Hungarian, and Scottish on my father's. On my Hokkamitan side, I am a member of Stamanis First Nation, known as the anglicized community of Chemanis on Vancouver Island, and I have many family ties to Cowichan tribes as well. And pictured here is one of our longhouses within Cowichan tribes, Clemelets, which is one of the 6 original villages that amalgamated together at the time that the Indian agents were coming through our territory in the late 1800s. Kate had mentioned earlier that I have been a family physician. I've worked in a number of different organizations, including First Nations Health Authority and First Nations Inuit Health Branch. And I'm now a medical health officer at Island Health. And I have the honor, privilege, and challenge of being a medical health officer in my home territory. And in that role, we as medical health officers have some ability to create our priorities in our work. And listed here, I'm sharing with you my priorities, which are within my area, which likely are priorities in many different areas across the province. So I really work every day within these areas, looking at climate disruption and biodiversity collapse, mental health conditions, and maternal, child, and family affliction. Now, the reasons I've picked these as my priorities are many, but I will say that with climate disruption and biodiversity collapse, we have the most significant threat to our health. With mental health conditions, by and large, in my community, across the island, across the province, across the country, it is very typically mental health conditions that are the highest in terms of chronic health conditions in our community. Depression and mood anxiety disorders are the largest burden throughout the area that I work with. And in terms of maternal, child, and family afflictions, this is the area where we have the highest return on any investments that we make. When people look at these priorities, sometimes they think it's kind of all over the map or, really seems kind of disjointed, but I see these things as very integrally connected. And any benefits we have in any area are going to have ripple effects in all areas. So really, in defining these priorities, what my ultimate goals are in terms of working towards those priorities is ultimately that we have connection to nature, because I think that is ultimately what will help with climate disruption and biodiversity collapse, that we work towards mental well-being, and that we work towards maternal, child, and family well-being. So this has been the major threads of what I've been trying to pull through in my work within the Cowichan Valley Regional District. And I've been in this role now for 3 years. And then earlier on this year, as we have all been, affected by COVID-19, has been declared a pandemic and is affecting all areas within health and having, changed lives for all of us. So it's such a pleasure to follow Jade, and she's such a valuable resource within our health authority to talk about the built environment and how we really need to look at making our built environment healthy places for us to be. And now I want to expand on what is often kind of talked about in terms of healthy built environment housing, and expand that to the concept of home. And Jade mentioned that in her presentation in the beginning when she was commenting, what is close to your home? What is around your home? What can you walk to? And what I really think as well with COVID-19 is, when we've asked to stay closer to home, we can't travel in ways that we have in the past. It has really caused us a lot more to reflect on home, to look around our home, and to value our home. So for myself, as a Halk't'mi'kmaq woman, I wanted to share this visual with you of my home. This is my home territory. This is a map created by the Halk't'mi'kmaq Treaty Group, which is a group of 6 First Nations within the area. And it was based on intensive, focused interviews with elders and other community members on what our landscape was and what our traditional relationships were with this landscape. So in blue areas, this is where we had alahut, or harvesting. In purple areas, this is where hehe, or cultural use, was undertaken. And we also have areas where sayaf, or oral traditions, tell us a lot about our long-standing relationships with the land. This was our healthy built environment as Halk't'mi'kmaq people. And I just want to reference that I have the pleasure of being in a different area of my home territory today than usual. I live in the North Cowichan area, but today I'm presenting to you from Salt Spring Island, and the star indicated there is where Jade and I are presenting to you from today, and also acknowledge that this was an area of intensive harvesting of especially marine food resources within this area. Now, in speaking to my home territory as a healthy built environment, I cannot, not reference active transport. So today, I came over to the island on a ferry, a BC ferry, so didn't have to use much of my internal power. But I did, 2 summers ago, have the incredible opportunity to travel by canoe with my daughters, who were then 2 and 7, by canoe from Maple Bay, which is in North Cowichan, to Huaquam, which is also known as Burgoyne Bay in Salt Spring Island. It was quite a trip, and I'll always remember that my 2-year-old was screaming the whole way because she didn't want to wear a life jacket. But it was just an amazing journey. Didn't take, just took slightly longer than the drive from my home to the ferry to get to Vesuvius, and was just such a way to become connected with the environment around us. So I have a picture here of some BC peoples also traveling by canoe. To the left of that, you'll see a picture of one of the villages that I talked about amongst the Cowichan communities. So this is the village of Huamachin in the late 1800s. And you can potentially, hopefully, see in the background there some of our housing, some of the places where we slept, cooked, especially during the rainy season. And you can see the waterway, the Cowichan River, the Cowichan Stalo, coming right up to the village site. And I think someone mentioned a question around parking earlier. Well, there is one of our canoes essentially, kind of parking in front of our community. And it's often talked about as our bodies of water being our highways as Indigenous peoples, especially on the coast of BC here. Now, of course, there was other ways of active transport, walking, trails, an extensive trail network throughout our community around the island as well. And so those being, major forms of active transport of how we got around our communities and built that relationship with our environment as we did it. Also, in terms of the healthy built environment, I wanted to reference a number of practices that we had as Coast Salish peoples, which are shared by some other peoples on the coast. And I really just want to reference that this aspect of the healthy built environment really cultivated what I was speaking to, our connection to nature, our connection to the amazing world around us that sustained us, and also reference the concepts around food security that Jade had spoken about earlier. So here on the top left picture is a man from Cowichan Tribes, my community, Harold Joe, and he's actually walking and inspecting part of the walls of a clam garden, actually here on Salt Spring Island. And so many of you may know about clam gardens. They have been around for generations upon generations, but in the broader public, they're just starting to be more known and talked about. And they were basically ways that we helped to create the environment around us, working together, building something that would help keep us with food resources year-round. So the picture on the right shows a little bit of a depiction of how communities worked together, altering the environment, which helped in creating a relationship with the environment and each other, which created security through many factors, including food security. In the bottom two pictures, I also must reference other means of relationship with the land and other ways to work with our other peoples, the plant peoples, to help sustain us. And this is ultimately a very important food staple, one of the main sources of carbohydrate for Halkminam people in the camas plant, particularly its bulbs, which are seen in the hand of the right picture in this slide. And the relationship of the environment with this plant was that the habitat for camas bulbs was very relational and a very tended environment. It wasn't really deemed to be at contact, a type of agriculture per se. I think they were viewed as pretty, and much records in the historic literature reference some of these fields of camas. One of the last remaining larger examples of these remain in Beacon Hill Park in Victoria, and so that's what this picture on the right is from. And we have a couple of places within the Cowichan Valley, one being the Garry Oak Preserves. And so this was where communities really developed a strong relationship, tended these plants. These were family plots, community plots that were passed down from generation to generation. An example of connection to the environment, health, and security. And so in speaking to those examples, I just also wanted to highlight how this is brought up within this depiction of the First Nations perspective on wellness that I had the honor of being part of creating the depiction around after communications with communities and stakeholders while I was at the First Nations Health Authority. And so I want to reference a few things in this depiction here before moving on, and that we are pictured as human centered who have mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual aspects to our health. And in this part of what we're highlighting here today, I just really wanted to draw a highlight to the yellow ring, which talks about wisdom, responsibility, relationships, and respect, and how that isn't only with family, community, and nations, but circled here in red specifically the land, the environment around us. We need to have respect, we have responsibilities too, and we have to form strong relationships with our environment, the land, the nature around us to support ourselves mentally, physically, and spiritually. And now we're in the time of COVID. And I just wanted to highlight here, some of you may have provided responses to the BC COVID-19 Population Health Survey that was out in May of this year. And I wanted to highlight a few areas here around some of the questions that were asked. People were asked if their mental health had been worsening since COVID-19. And 46% of people, and this is, I want to highlight just for Vancouver Island, and SVI is South Vancouver Island, CVI Central, and NVI North. So fairly consistent across the board, but more so in the South Island, residents reporting their mental health worsening since COVID. When we asked a question around whether people reported they were quite or extremely stressed since COVID, you can see here again a fairly consistent response across the island of 16% of residents saying they were quite or extremely stressed. And of particular importance here, I think, to highlight is the bottom graph, which is when, and this was only answered by adults, this survey, but caregivers for children were asked if their school-aged children reported increased levels of stress. And here you can see, again, across the board, fairly consistent answers of 61% of people answering this survey saying that they had seen an increased level in child stress. And what was going on at that time? We had decreased access to medical health services. We were in, it might mean different things in different places, but I'll use my air quotes here when I'm saying we were just really coming out of a more intensive kind of lockdown type experience where we didn't have the opportunity to have those social interactions that Jade was talking about that we know make us healthy and resilient as individuals and communities. I will speak to briefly here, being someone who was helping to protect health within the Cowichan Valley region, that there was a lot of discussions, and I know there's people here from local government and First Nations governments. There was a lot of discussions that we were having as medical health officers around what would happen in terms of access to things such as playgrounds, public parks, trails, access to, the things around us. And I remember in one of those particularly tense afternoons as we were watching cases around the world and wondering what was going to happen within our own region, the conversation around trails in the Cowichan Valley region, and did I think that we needed to, restrict access to help promote health, or help protect health rather. And in those conversations, I really spoke to the fact of that I felt still having access to be able to have a connection to nature through means such as trails was extremely important, especially in this time of increased stress. I take some of that from my teachings as a Halkminam woman and the importance of our connection to nature for our mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual health. But I also want to highlight that there's a growing body of evidence within Western academic literature as well with regards to the importance of nature and our connection to it for health as well. A couple over the last year or so that I wanted to highlight here are, looking at nature and mental health as an ecosystem service perspective. Things like Jade had highlighted in her presentation, the links among contacts with the natural environment, community cohesion, and decrease in crime. And I also want to highlight some very more interesting things, very much from a Western perspective, but looking at, kind of even more that, controlled experiment type approach where people are starting to look at time doses. What is the minimum time dose in nature to positively impact the mental health of college-age students in this article referenced here. And then another study that came out last year, which depicts a time, 120 minutes, a couple of hours of a week in nature being associated with good health and well-being. So in highlighting this, I also really want to expand another horizon, and I speak to this more and more in my role as a medical health officer, working within a health system, working within island health, that we need to, I think, recognize, especially in these times of COVID, that the ecosystem is the foundation of our health system. It's what helps keep us healthy in the first place, and especially important when our other opportunities for connection become more limited when we're dealing with something like a pandemic. I also wanted to highlight in terms of that ecosystem and what we need to do in order to protect it, because at the time that we were underneath this crisis, multiple crises, the opioid overdose crises, the pandemic, and a climate crisis and biodiversity collapse crises, that we need to look to models and how we can help navigate our way through this. And being a Halkminam woman, I just really highlight our approaches to our relationships to health and our environment, and ultimately have some gratitude that this is being recognized more and more within the broader sphere in terms of its importance for us as people and for the planet. So this is a report that came out from the the UN Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And it really took a look at, it was an unprecedented report, took over 3 years to complete, had over 50 authors, one from here in BC, Kai Chan at the University of BC. And what it ultimately found is a number of things that I really wanted to highlight around Indigenous sovereignty. What it found is that nature is generally declining less rapidly in Indigenous peoples' lands than in other lands, and that this is relevant to broader society, and that governance, including customary institutions and management systems and co-management regimes involving Indigenous peoples and local communities, can be an effective way to safeguard nature. I think this is important for our climate crisis, pandemic, and ultimately for our overdose crisis as well. And why is that so? I think it's because in the way we see the world as Indigenous peoples, in terms of the perspective on wellness, which is not one nation or community's quote unquote approach, but just some general concepts that a lot of Indigenous communities share. And so this here is from some of the work of Halkminam Treaty Group, so from the peoples that I am part of. And really it says here, we are not of the land, we are the land. Why nature is safeguarded where Indigenous peoples have ownership, control, or co-governance is because the land is us. And our lawmaking authority will empower us to be the architects of a sustainable future for our lands. So ultimately, I want to highlight that Indigenous sovereignty is sustainability. Within my own home territory, so that map I depicted for you earlier of my home territory, pretty much 95% of that territory is privately owned. There's not Crown territory per se in the area where I live. There was, in the late 1800s, the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway, the E&N Railway. There was some work where a lot of land was co-opted, grabbed, stolen, and given into the hands of someone who was going to create a railway from the south of Vancouver Island to Nanaimo. So basically, in terms of our ability to own or control our land, to really allow our fullest relationships with our healthy built environment, with our territory as Halkminam people, was forever altered and impeded by that land grab in the late 1870s. But what I have the privilege and honor to be part of as a local medical health officer is one example that is now over a decade old of how co-governance works on a day by day, month by month basis with the Cowichan Watershed Board. So this was a board that was formed after a number of summers were showing us that climate change and drought was having a devastating impact on one of the lifebloods of our community for Hulkaminam peoples, but also all peoples living within the Cowichan Valley having, strong, in many cases, ties to the Cowichan River. The low flows were basically going to cause decimation of the salmon population, which is one of our relationships that has helped sustain us as Hulkaminam peoples since time immemorial. And what was determined was that there would be a board to help bring decision-making closer to home, which was co-chaired by Cowichan tribes, so the immediate Indigenous territory in which the river flows, and the Cowichan Valley Regional District. So this is one example of those co-governance type relationships which ultimately I've been involved with and I can see helps create a more sustainable future for all the peoples that live within the Cowichan Valley. And so I'll end there and just want to reiterate the key messages that I hope came through in this time that I've been able to share with you, and that I really want to ensure that the built environment supports connection to nature, that we value the ecosystem as the foundation of the health system, which is especially critical in this time of COVID-19, and that you can look for ways to create spaces or promote models in your work that reestablish Indigenous sovereignty through ownership, control, management, or co-governance. And with that, I'll say thank you, Hait Sapka, and yes, also very happy to take questions and know that Jade may have some other questions her way as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Waters. I feel like for your presentation and for Jade's presentation, I was just sitting here enraptured as you spoke. So I really appreciate you both sharing your knowledge this morning with myself and with everybody else on the call. I think we'll start, Dr. Waters, with some questions for you, and then I'll go interspersing Jade and yourself as we go on. There are some questions in the question box, and as I mentioned before, if anybody would like to ask a question, just feel free to do so anytime. So the first question, Dr. Waters, how can health practitioners begin to integrate the practices that you're talking about in their day-to-day work?
So yeah, I get this question from some of my colleagues as well, and I think it's in terms of how we frame things. And so that's why I really wanted to highlight, and let me just say, this is not something that Island Health has endorsed, but I feel more and more emboldened that is a message we need to spread and hear, in that, we really need to recognize our ecosystem as the foundation of our health system. So I'll give an example of one scenario within my home territory, which let me just say, I value the Western health system. I had my appendix out last summer, so I needed to go to our local hospital. And there's been a lot of work within my territory. Our hospital is old, and a lot of work done by many players to help bring a new hospital into our region, which is needed. But I think and we've had a new hospital open in the North Island in the Comox Valley and Campbell River. And I will say I was briefly the medical director in the Comox Valley and Campbell River areas. And when the new hospitals were being opened in the area, there were two, $300 million facilities, like, of course, a lot of excitement in the community. And I think a lot of people felt like when those new hospitals opened, like everyone would be healthier, like there was this anticipation, like let's get to that point. And I'm sad but not surprised to say that they were bigger facilities with more beds, and within days of opening, they were back up at, over census numbers like they had been before. So it's not that we don't need these types of services, we do, and there's many things we've been able to do with Western medical care. But I think what we also need to do, and what I'm trying to do within the Cowichan Valley, is not put all our focus and attention on acute health care services, on things like hospitals being, kind of golden tickets for, people to have improved health in the region. One of my roles, I think, is to try and keep that focus also on the many other things within our region that keep us well. And the river is important, our trees are important, our watersheds are important, our relationships to the ocean are important. All those are things that keep us healthy. So I think really trying to flip that perspective a little bit, which I think, and Jade was talking about, little bits, small pieces coming together, creating more of a rising tide. I think if we can all try and shift that perspective a little bit with each day moving, that'll help a lot. And I think what this health crisis of COVID-19 is really showing us is that that is more critical than ever. Some of the biggest impacts on the societal level, and let me just say, want to acknowledge that there have been people who have become sick, needed hospitalization, and people who have passed away from COVID. And I acknowledge that. But I think also on a broader approach, that at a broader population level, the mental health impacts of how we've had to change our lives during this time are where we have some of the highest burden. And it's in looking at what's around us that also keeps us well and building those connections that I think will help with COVID, with the climate crisis, and with other things that we will face.
Thank you so much for that very detailed response. That's wonderful. Another question, and I imagine this is related in a number of ways. How can non-Indigenous peoples begin to take on their responsibility to the land in a way that is respectful of both the land and Indigenous peoples?
Thanks for that question. And I think there's a lot more thoughtful reflections on who we all are individually coming to this work that we need to do collectively with Black Lives Matters going on around the world, and with, particularly here in BC right now, some of the look around racism in healthcare. And I think, we're again making, progress over time. I think, fairly expected and valued now in terms of presentations like what we've shared here today is that there is an acknowledgement of territory at the beginning of such types of discussions. But what I also think is important is for individuals, non-Indigenous individuals, to find out about whose home territory they were in. And I think we, in that acknowledgement, it acknowledges that. But what were those special relationships that those peoples had in the territory that you live, work, and play? Because I think ultimately, to help protect the health of us all, we need to find out about and support those local relationships. And those aren't just relationships that Indigenous peoples can have with the land, but that is something that has kept people who have lived within these regions healthy for generations upon generations. And the reality is a lot of that territory and the relationships that may have been had has been altered, sometimes catastrophically. And so and that's where I feel like, can people look in their daily work? And I think we all might have examples if we try and look, at it from a different perspective. Is there opportunities where we should say, I think there needs to be, local co-governance with Indigenous peoples and how decisions are made in this regard. And so I think particularly in terms of land use planning is a really great place to start that.
Thank you so much. One other question that is probably great for both of you, but maybe Shannon, we'll start off with you if you'd like to take the first stab at it. To what degree does nature have to be natural? For example, I lived in Calgary for years and there was this kind of hothouse slash greenhouse area on the top floor of a building. It was a lovely refuge in the dead of winter, but certainly not natural to Calgary. Are somewhat artificially created environments beneficial?
Thanks for this question, because I think it's an important one. I would say yes. In terms of, promoting human health, yes. I think, green spaces, like Jade had mentioned in her presentation, man-made green spaces, parks or green spaces, especially on top of a building that wouldn't, there wouldn't have been a green space there otherwise if it wasn't, human-made, can help improve health. But I think our biggest bang for our buck, our highest return on our investment, is preserving those spaces that are natural, that are ecosystems, because that is where we build the resilience with the other peoples, the other, parts of nature that we cohabit, this planet with. We build that relationship and, can find ways to help us and the environment around us become more resilient. So I think ultimately where we already have a lot of altering of the natural environment, I think putting, human-made aspects of green space in is important. And I think it is also just as imperative, especially which is often a lot more rural locations, which Jade spoke to in some of her responses. It is just as imperative to preserve what we can about our functioning ecosystems and our relationships with those to help promote our health.
Thank you so much. Jade, did you want to also address that question?
Yeah, Shannon did a beautiful job at responding to that. So, I mean, I would guess I would just further add, well, also echo, yes. We have modified so much of our surroundings through, over hundreds of years. So if there is, those spaces and places of refuge that we can create and pepper through the built environment, it will help collectively on a neighborhood or citywide scale to improve our resilience, help to curb some of those that I was speaking, urban impact, naming but just one. Creating those spaces and places for refuge and for reflection when we're all so stressed to the max. So I 100% agree with Shannon, the protection and preservation of our natural spaces when and where possible. But in our built environment, I'm sorry, I flashed up a couple of deck and realize that they flashed up rather quickly, but can we be innovative, through, greening our built infrastructure, such as green roofs, creating, I love that little example of like a greenhouse on the top of a roof. What about, I've seen some interventions being done in again, really urban settings where they're creating almost these little micro parks, but actually helping through the collection of these micro parks, they're actually helping to promote biodiversity within that urban form. So one of those other images that I flashed up is again, really urban example. I think it's being done quite actively in China. I've seen it in Australia, places in the US and in Canada as well, is those vertical forests that, creating those mid to high rise type of and greening, it as much as humanly possible. I think that in and of itself will help to bolster our resilience collectively through those interventions.
That's great. I think both of your answers really flow well into this next question. And I know, Jade, you were just talking about plants being on the outside of buildings, but this individual asks, what about for people who are shut-ins? What could be done for those folks indoors in their own homes?
Thanks, Kate. And yeah, I think, you know, that research that I was showcasing that I just learned about last week around the creating of green blocks, and if the link is in my slide deck, where it's looking at those views of nature. So if that's at all available, your views of nature in your outdoor environment, even just looking at that has been shown to have immense therapeutic effects. You can bring those plants indoors. You know, if you have a tolerance to that, or you enjoy that, that can also really help. It also helps to inject that lovely fresh air and oxygen into your inside and interior environment. But even that same study just talked, I mean, if that's not within your, you know, is not available to you, even images of nature has an impact on your health and well-being. So maybe some potential actions for being, you know, for those that are more shut in or confined indoors.
Thank you, Jade. Dr. Waters, did you have any response to that question, or would you prefer to just have left it there?
Yeah, I think Jade, I don't have anything to add to Jade's answer, thanks.
For sure. So next question, how do you see, I know there are references, Dr. Waters, in your presentation on the studies being done, and of course you referenced the immense knowledge Indigenous peoples have on health and connectedness with ecosystems. Are there changes that you see taking place to the health system? Is this being integrated more readily, or is it still sort of a slow process?
Actually, and sorry, as you were saying that, I did think of something to add to Jade's answer.
Oh, please do, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I think, you know, when we're talking about people who might be more isolated indoors, I think that's usually often people who are adult age. And so I just think what I would add to that is the importance of focusing on maternal, child, and family health, because I think forming those relationships with the natural environment, especially in youth, have long-lasting positive benefits throughout the lifetime. So just that, I mean, it's not like Jade's answer, I think, was giving some very practical examples of how to help the individual who might be at that particular point in their life. But I think I also just want to highlight that certainly, you know, investing in, you know, things like we're talking, having conversations within Island Health now about early childhood education out of doors. Those things have positive benefits throughout the lifetime, which is why I think it's such a important area to focus investment. Then
Fantastic,
I think,
thank you.
yeah, Kate, and then I think for the question you just asked me, is the crux of it that do I see some of this change in approach to looking more at ecosystems as part of health?
Yeah, and I think just for both of you, do you see the changes that you want to be seeing in your areas of work?
Not anywhere near the scale I think we need to be at. But I think, you know, even just us having this conversation here with you today is part of that. And I will say, quite honestly, you know, I've been in a public health and preventative medicine physician since 2009. I've even become more focused on spreading these types of messages over time because I now see the rising importance of it being spoken to. I think we have a more receptive ear in a lot of places right now. I still think we have, and I'm just speaking from a health system perspective, often too much of a focus on acute healthcare services rather than things that keep us healthy in the first place. But I think we also have a real opportunity because of this crisis we're in with COVID to really focus on what's going to keep us mentally well when our lives have had to change. And so, I mean, really trying to take what we can as any, you know, benefits of this intense and very difficult time is really why I'm so glad conversations like this are happening.
Wonderful, thank you. Jade, did you want to address that as well? Or
Thank
would
you,
you like to
Kate.
move
I
on?
did. I wanted to just add one other thing, if I may. Again, completely agree with Shannon in so many respects. But I flashed up a slide there too, and it was talking about social determinants of health. I noticed that there's quite a good contingent of health professionals that dialed into this call, and I think that's a very it's a concept that we're very familiar with in public health. But I see one thing that I'm seeing a rising tide of is it's expanding upon that concept and well-defined definition to the ecological determinants of health. And so I would encourage for any callers still on the line to look into the ecological determinants of health, and it is, our health is our wealth, and it is so much connected to our natural environment. Although our built environment is immensely significant, of course, as I presented, but so tied to nature as well, and spreading the wings of our concepts of health and well-being.
Awesome, thank you. And actually, as you mentioned the built environment, there's a question that came in that links maybe a bit more to the built environment. So maybe we'll start with you for this one, Jade, and then we can go to Dr. Waters afterwards too, if there's extra comments. But are you aware of any policies in local government that demonstrate the principal linkages between health factors and transportation choices, and how they should be considered in capital projects?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'd say I'm seeing local governments doing some phenomenal work in this regard. We're not just seeing like transportation master plans anymore. We're seeing active transportation plans and policies putting people first in that pyramid or hierarchy of transportation users. We are putting people above and beyond cars. So I am seeing that immensely, this huge movement, this rising tide in the best way possible for a real shift towards active transportation, whether in an urban setting versus a rural setting. Transportation, I know, is a real barrier and challenge for people to get from point A to point B, but how can we embed in those healthier choices into our built environment? And I'm seeing not only this amazing positive movement for making those connections to health within those plans. Actually, one thing that's kind of foundational to my role within Island Health is working with local government and predominantly their land use planners and providing, comments on land use planning referrals. I always say I find myself a bit of like a health, just trying to champion the consideration of health within the development of, say, an official community plan to other affiliated master plans. And I'm seeing the health language really being embedded in there. It's so positive to see that kind of almost a health and all policies approach kind of shining through in some of these plans. And I look forward to continuing that.
Thank you. Dr. Waters, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Could you repeat the beginning again, Kate?
Yeah, definitely. Are you aware of any policies in local government that demonstrate the principal linkages between health factors and transportation choices and how they should be considered in capital projects?
Yeah, like I'll give an example just from the region that I work within. Like many regions, I think, across the province, we have a major highway going right through the center of town. And so it really, causes some impacts on, choices to cycle or walk because of perceived, factors that are very real in some cases in terms of risks with, vehicle collisions or what have you. And so really, the local First Nations community has done a active transportation plan as the municipality. And one of the things I think which we, sometimes see as a negative factor, but here is also a really positive factor, is a lot of our community travels by foot still. And so how can we, champion that and look at it as, you know, something that can in some cases be an impediment to accessing services, but in many other cases is helping to keep us, you know, healthy in the first place. And that very much needs to be taken into consideration with regards to, you know, larger municipality, regional district decisions around transportation plans and trails and what have you. And really the bringing in of youth into that conversation, especially when they, you know, aren't people who are driving yet, is important. I'm sure many on this call are aware of the work around a concept called 880 communities, which is making a community as easily accessible and safe for an 8-year-old and also an 80-year-old to travel around. And I think, you know, that just really has so many concepts that are aligned with Indigenous communities' approaches of valuing elders and our children. And, you know, our communities need to be places where, you know, individuals of those age brackets and stages of life can get around safely and, you know, in ways that help build connection and resiliency.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that answer. And I have one more question. If anybody else has questions before we answer it, then please put them in, but we may wrap up with this question. So I know that the focus of BC Regional Adaptation Collaborative is climate change, but I'm wondering, in your experiences, Dr. Waters and Jade, how connected do you see the sort of the climate change focused professionals and the health professionals? Because I think both of your visions of a future world is the ideal climate resilient world and socially resilient world. Do you find that those connections are present, or is there anything that needs to be done to strengthen that? Because we need to be putting your visions forward.
So yeah, this is Shannon. I can start off and then let Jade add her thoughts too. Yeah, I think both Jade and I think go to a number of meetings and you know, discussions around climate change and, you know, what we need to do collectively to work through this. And I think one thing I've heard distinctly in the past number of years is that, you know, bringing in the health aspect to this discussion really makes people realize that this is about all of us and we are all going to be affected. So I think, you know, that I've had the privilege and actually it brings me a lot of meaning and purpose in my work and helping to bring health conversations into areas that health maybe wasn't a large part of before. So I'll use the Cowichan Watershed Board as an example. It was formed, I think, initially out of concerns because of fish populations, which in my mind is a very obvious link to health in terms of our food security, our, you know, active, healthy ways of, you know, navigating rivers, oceans, you know, fishing, preparing. But there wasn't per se a health aspect to that conversation initially. And I think the question is around climate change, but I think protecting our watersheds and protecting our environments is a key aspect of combating climate change. And so I am taking great joy and inspiration in finding ways to bring health into all conversations. I think Jade spoke to health in all policies earlier, and yeah, so that's a key aspect in what I'm trying to do in you know, bringing, you know, the gifts and the role that I have to working through this together.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for that, Shannon. Yeah, a couple things buzzing through my head, but it's interesting. In preparation for today's webinar, I had a chance to reach out to some of my health and built environment colleagues around the province, and one in particular, maybe on the line, mentioned to me. She said, we both attended actually a conference together last year, at the Livable Cities Forum, and the forum, and Shannon was there as well, and the forum was all about the linkages between climate change and health. And one thing that I found emerged so clearly and evidently for me, as it did for my colleague, is that we can get into this discussion around climate change, and sometimes I know I'm speaking to the wrong group about this because I think it's all a captive audience, but there's still those climate deniers, the naysayers, the pushback, the resistance to that. But as soon as you frame it around health improvement, I feel like that some of that stigma starts to dissolve. And what about having the conversation be all about health and putting health first? I think health is pretty damn top of mind for us all right now during the crisis, during the pandemic. So if you frame it with improving active transportation is good for your health, well, hey, we're also going to decrease our carbon footprint and increase our community resilience, but one intervention. I think that, alternatively, like I was saying, green space. And if we help to bolster and pepper green space throughout our built environment, it's going to be immensely impactful to curb the rising tide of climate change, that tsunami that's upon us. But it's going to be good for our health, our well-being. We have those spaces of refuge to reflect in nature, to breathe the fresh air. It's good for our water quality, our entire, ecological systems, which in turn is good for us. So I think maybe it's that reframing of discussion. I don't know if I'm answering your question, Kate, and I went on a tangent there, but I'd say, yes, I'm seeing these conversations happening at provincial scales, at local government scales, at community scales. So I think we can just do so much more together, and collaboration is so key.
That's great. Yes, you definitely did answer my question. And I see we have 2 more minutes, so that was actually perfect timing for those questions. I wanted to thank both of you so much for spending your time to give these presentations and also provide such thoughtful responses to all of the questions that were raised, and just really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and bringing this really wonderful vision of how we can make the world more resilient into the BC RAC webinar series. Thank you both so much.
A pleasure, thank you.
And thank you as well to all of the attendees who came. We had over 100, and now we're down to the last folks who have stayed with us for the entire time. Thanks for being here today, and to everybody, have a wonderful rest of your day and a very nice weekend.